So in our Bibles this morning to the book of Nehemiah, chapter 2, verse 10. Several weeks ago, we began this book of Nehemiah, a man born in captivity in Babylon, though a Jew. And in 446 BC, as the king's cupbearer, God began to move on Nehemiah's heart that he should consider finding a way to go 700 miles away to a city he had never seen, to rebuild walls that he knew were down and a people that were suffering for generations as a result. And yet, the position he found himself in made that almost impossible, but pray he would. And we looked at chapter 1 and saw how God births the desires of his will in the hearts of the people, usually with an individual, usually with what breaks your heart and what matters to you more than anything else. Nehemiah spent months praying, and he didn't really get an answer, but he didn't just sit idly by, he planned. So by the time you get to chapter 2 and the king says, "What do you need?" Nehemiah had an answer. And what will it take? He had a response. And how long will you be gone? And when will you return? And he had answers for all of those things. He'd been planning ahead, prepared, we called it. And then last week in chapter 2, verses 11 through 20, we saw Nehemiah finally make the journey. 7 months or so after he began to pray, he arrives in Jerusalem, sees the damage, first time for himself, gathers from the Lord direction, then passes that along to the people, sharing the vision that God had given to him. And the people were thrilled. Let's do this. God has been so good to bring you, and we look forward to having a wall. But at every step along the way, opposition finds itself opposing the work of God. And before we go to chapter 3, which is where we should be this morning, I thought we might just stop for one Sunday and take a look specifically at how the enemy seeks to stop what God wants to do. Because it's a recurring theme in Nehemiah, and rather than catching it as we go, maybe we'll just look at 4 or 5 examples of that this morning. Paul said to Timothy, his last letter he wrote him before he died, "Timothy, if you want to live a godly life in Christ Jesus, you will suffer persecution." He didn't say you might suffer persecution, which would have been better for me. That means you might not. But will kind of sums it up. You're going to get it if you're going to try to live for the Lord. And no matter what you do, in whatever place God has put you, when you begin to minister in the name of the Lord, opposition will come. It'll come from the world system that doesn't want anything to do with God. It'll come from your flesh, which is only interested in itself. It'll come from the devil and all of his little helpers, because they don't want God glorified or you blessed. And working in concert together, they will do whatever the Lord will allow it by any means possible to stop the progress. And it is one of those themes in Nehemiah that not only are we given the fact that it happens, but we're told how to deal with it. So I thought we could look this morning at some verses that say, expect opposition. For Nehemiah, the job was to build the wall. The wall would provide protection for the people. It would bail them out of, a century and a half of being the laughingstock of the neighborhood, sitting ducks to the, enemies of prey, the scandal that it brought to the name of the Lord. They needed to have this wall built. It was part of their protection. And the minute Nehemiah stepped out, so did the enemy. We are called by the Lord as the church to go into the world to rebuild lives as well. Lives that the enemy has destroyed and laid waste, the ones that he'd like to keep that way. So anytime you're going to reach out with the gospel or the mercy of God and the grace of God to share with folks, you're going to get opposition. And it's going to be that same battle. But as you seek to rebuild what sin and the enemy has destroyed. We have 4 points that we'd like you to think about this morning, and then we'll give you the solutions for them. But we begin here in chapter 2, verse 10, with these words, and this will be our first point. Opposition begins by nature. We read in verse 1, verse 10, when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official heard of it, they were deeply disturbed that a man had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel. Now, just for context, Nehemiah has finally got to leave where he was in the palace, head for Jerusalem, the blessings of the king, his PO orders in his pocket, full support. And only the news of what he was planning to do preceded him to Jerusalem. And these 2 men in particular, and we mentioned them, I think, last time, small group yet, they'll grow though, were absolutely upset that someone was coming to help the Jews. Now, who in their right mind would be angry that someone would try to put a wall around families to protect themselves? Where the kids could play in the streets and the parents could sit in the backyard and they'd have to jump every time they heard a noise or be fearful every time somebody rode through town. I mean, the natural thing for anyone would be to say, that's a great thing, they need that. But not when it comes to spiritual warfare. And the minute that you begin to enter into the work of God, these very disturbing, oppositions rise their ugly head. Two guys 700 miles away, and the description of them is they are deeply disturbed. They are saddened beyond measure that someone would come and do something good for the people of God. The single most important work that you and I have been given by the Lord is to see that the lost are saved. It's more important than feeding the poor, than housing the homeless. It is far more important than changing the environment or saving the ocean. People need to know Christ. And it is the function and the calling and the purpose of the church to shine its lights in dark places so that people get saved. It is everyone's calling as a believer. The problem is the minute you enter into the battle for the lives of the people, you run into this natural consequence of resistance. By nature, the natural man who lives in darkness, who is bound to his sin, who doesn't see the things of God, and who's naturally resistant to the things that God would want to do. And though you have only good in mind, I just want you to know the Lord that I know. I just want you to love the God that loves you. You will run into immediate opposition. It almost makes no sense, but there it is. When Paul stood before Agrippa in Acts 26 and he explained to him how God had saved him, he then said, the Lord at that time said to me that he was going to deliver me from the Jewish people and as well as the Gentiles to whom he was now sending me, so that I might open their eyes in order that they might turn from darkness to light, from the power of Satan to God, that they might receive forgiveness of their sins, that they might receive an inheritance that God has made available to all who are sanctified by faith in him. Paul said that was my calling, that people might get out of the hole that they're in and the blindness that has come and the enemy's power and find life. And here two men, they hadn't met Nehemiah, they didn't know that he was a good guy, they questioned right away his purposes, but they hated him not having met him. And they resisted him, though they'd only heard about him some 700 miles away. It is almost, a prejudiced attitude that you wonder where it comes from, but don't wonder too long, because this is a battle you've found yourself in. And as the church goes out to preach the gospel and to share the love of God, you will naturally run into resistance. You can't escape it, really. When Paul wrote to the Corinthians in chapter 4, he said, if our gospel is hidden, it is hidden from those who are perishing, whom the God of this world has blinded the minds of those that do not believe, lest the glorious light of the gospel of Christ, the image of God, should shine upon them. That's the battleground. And it is warfare. Paul said, you don't war, and we don't war against flesh and blood. That's important to know. Your wife is not your enemy. Neither is your neighbor, the guy that cut you off on the freeway, your boss, your coworker. They might be tools of the enemy, but they are not the enemy. He said we war against principalities and powers and rulers of darkness and spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places. That's where our battle is. That's where the fight comes in. And it occurs first because of the nature of man. Nehemiah is singing God's praises. He's got money and resources and permission and authority. Yes, God is good. And there's two guys going, man, I hate that guy. And he hasn't done a thing. Jesus got his boys together in John 15 and he sat them down. He said, look, if the world hates you, you should know that it hated me before it hated you. And if you were of the world, you would be loved by the world. But it's because you're not of the world. I've chosen you out of this world. Therefore, they hate you. So look, don't forget. Remember this word. The servant isn't greater than his master. And if they've hated me, they'll hate you. And if they've listened to me, they'll listen to you. But they're going to do these things to you for my name's sake because they don't know him who sent me. And that's the issue, You go out to serve the Lord, expect opposition. Why? Because we're entering into a spiritual battle. There are some times when you go out and you lay your hand to the task, it may just be a few people like Sanballat and Tobiah here, but they're not going to go away. And I've heard Christians sometimes say, well, what did I do wrong? I said everything right. I meant right. Well, you didn't do anything wrong. It's just part of the deal, You're standing up for the Lord in a world that's opposed to him. In the world you'll have tribulation. Be of good cheer. I've overcome the world. And remember what we read in Psalm 2 this morning. In the end, the Lord wins. Better to kiss the Son and do it quickly. But like Nehemiah, you enter the fray because you step out to serve God. And the cause is sin, and the nature of man is at the root of the opposition. It isn't you. It's the work of God in you. And if you'll see that clearly, you won't be so put off when it gets to be difficult because you're out sharing your faith. Oh, they're so mean. They're so hard-hearted. They're so, short-tempered. They just don't seem to hear me. They misunderstood. I don't know. Get used to it. Nehemiah whistling all the way to Jerusalem while guys sat up on a hill cursing him already. By the time we get to verse 19 of chapter 2, we come to our second lesson, and that is that opposition not only comes by nature, but it usually takes the form of mockery and ridicule in its infant stages. Notice we read, when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab, they heard of it, they laughed at us and despised us and said, what is this thing that you're doing? Will you rebel against the king? Now, by the time we come to this verse, Nehemiah has arrived in town, gotten a vision from the Lord, shared that vision with everyone, even pointed out all of the stuff outside that the king had given him, and it had thrilled the people. Let's rise up and build, they said. And they set their hands to this good work. You'll read there in verse 18. The people were thrilled, enthusiastic, vigorous. Let's in earnest go do the work of God. But now we turn again to the opposition. Now there's not two, there's three. Okay, it's still just three. It is a 50% growth, though, if you're doing the math. And this time, notice that the people who were deeply disturbed back in chapter 2, verse 10, are now laughing and despising this beginning of a good work, even intimating in their question that this was a rebellious work against the king to try to make your own place, and suggesting that the motives of this work were wicked. So lying and slander and mockery, just to try to stop this work of God. Now, Nehemiah, to his credit, doesn't engage them, doesn't say, hey, let me show you the king's letter, you morons, or get even with them, or try to fight fire with fire. He just leaves them be. Doesn't really, give them the time of day. Was just interested in serving the Lord. But notice that immediately when the work began, the two had become three, and the deeply disturbed were now laughing with a heart of despising the work and questioning if they had the authority and what were their motives and what was driving them really. And the people began to be under attack, and they had just barely started. Now, we'll skip chapter 3, which is a report, and we'll look at it next week, of how good things were going. And we'll go to chapter 4, verse 1, where the criticism continues. And we read the words, but it so happened, when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, that he was furious, very indignant, and he began to mock the Jews. He spoke before his brethren and before the army of Samaria. He said, what are these feeble Jews doing? Will they fortify themselves? Will they offer sacrifice? Will they complete it in a day? Will they revive stones from the heaps of rubbish, stones that are burned? And Tobiah, the Ammonite, was beside him. He said, whatever they build, even if a fox goes up on it, he'll break down their stone wall. Now, following these great strides of progress in chapter 3 and the Lord's work going forward, the work is nearly halfway done when these guys come back. Now, there is the ringleaders, and now they've got an army of people with them. But wait, they'll grow yet when we get to verse 7. And notice that they haven't really given up on their criticism and their chastising and their mockery, but now it is driven by a fury and an indignation that drives them to begin to mock the people of God. It is interesting in the scriptures that as the progress goes forward in the work of God, so often does the opposition. And the further you go, the more it seems reinforcement the enemy tries to gather. The group is growing now. Now they have an army of people. Their voices are louder. Their attacks are more rhetorical, They are driven by hateful emotion, and they just want to do one thing. They want to stop this work. And so the war of words. And interesting, as you read through Nehemiah, the critics for many, many months, or weeks through here, I should say, they never show their faces. Isn't it interesting that when people seem to oppose the things of God, they won't necessarily tell you to your face? Critics are often like that. They live in the shadows and behind the scenes, and there's an undercurrent of slander and bitterness and mumbling and ridicule and name-calling. And notice what he says here, kind of belittling the work. I mean, that seems to be their MO, He calls the Jews feeble. It's a word that means weak, but it's almost an insulting word. It's kind of like you weak little punk you, It's kind of like you couldn't lift your arms if you tried kind of weak. What are these broken, feeble Jews trying to accomplish here? Do they really think they can fortify themselves, literally protect themselves or keep themselves safe? I suppose next thing they're going to be wanting to sacrifice to their God and go to that religion of the weak. Oh, look how fast they're moving. I think they plan to finish today. If they can make life out of this broken down heap of stones and rubble. And then that other little boy there, punk Tobiah, he chimes in, right? Little fox could knock it over. But learn the lesson here for a minute. When you step out to serve the Lord, one of Satan's greatest tools against the work of God is criticism, to discourage you. And you might have experienced some of it yourself. The enemy oftentimes portrays those who would live godly lives as being weak. Oh, you Christians, you're always praying and stuff. Can't you just stand on your own 2 feet, Do you really need God in your life? Come on, man. And then, they despise you for your faith in God. They mock you that your work holds no future, that it has no impact, that it brings no influence. They laugh at your hope in God, and they mock your diligence, to serve the Lord. I mean, Christians, not only in our culture, but in many cultures around the world, are portrayed usually as just being unstable. I mean, we're a bunch of weirdos, We're behind the times, and we're bigots, and we don't want women to have their own rights, and we're prejudiced against homosexuals, and we have holier-than-thou attitudes towards drinking and premarital sex, and hey, the list goes on. We are the fodder for the comedians. Them right-wing, conservative, crazy Christians. And look at here how the enemy went after Nehemiah and the people that were serving God, doing the work that hadn't been done for 160 years. Satan will mock your ideas. He will question your motives. He will incessantly point out your weaknesses and your inabilities. He'll laugh at your zeal as somehow if it's misdirected. And as Tobiah pointed out the fence, the enemy will seek to lessen the value of your labor in the Lord through ridicule. I remember when I first started teaching years ago, Bible study, I really felt God called me to teach. And I took over a study for a guy that had led me to the Lord and given me the opportunity to teach. There were about 125 people that came to this Bible study in a house on Thursday nights. 3 weeks in, there were 4 people left. This was my work in the Lord. And I remember the enemy saying, "You're a loser. What are you doing here? Things were fine till you started." And it's hard to argue when people are leaving by the busload, All you hear are screeching tires. But so often the work of God begins humbly, You witness to somebody and maybe they turn away and the enemy says, "What are you doing? Nobody gets saved when you talk to them. You're terrible at it. Just shut up. Loser. All right. What are you praying for? What difference has that ever made in your prayers? You really think you can make a difference? Look, buddy, nobody cares. And the enemy comes to ridicule. And the unfortunate thing is, so often it works. Because my flesh hates to be ridiculed. I hate to be the object of scorn. I don't want to be the bad guy. I want to be the good guy, I want people to like me. I want them to be on my side, not against me. So, when the enemy begins to direct those things and, I don't want to cause a stir. You don't want to stick out. You don't be tagged as some Jesus freak. So he leans on you, and it works. And he leaned on the work here. They did it in fury, with indignant attitudes, mocking them, questioning their work, challenging their capabilities, making fun of the work that they were doing. And I suspect that the wall did not look good. And we'll look at that later. But I suspect, when you get priests to build walls, they're not good at it. You get construction people. I'm sure the wall wow, that's quite a wall there, And I'm sure the thing just had a natural little bend. But that didn't matter. It was God who was working through them. So, ridicule can keep you from serving the Lord. It can keep you from getting saved. It can keep you out of heaven and out of the saving arms of the Lord who loves you. So ridicule continued. We read in verse 7, or actually in verse 6, we built the wall. The entire wall was joined together up to half its height. It was halfway done. When we read in verse 7, now it happened when, and notice how the army is growing here, Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites, when they heard that the wall of Jerusalem was being restored and the gaps were beginning to be closed, they became very angry. It seems to be their method of operations, anger. And all of them began to conspire together how they could come and attack Jerusalem and create confusion. So from the opposition originating in the nature of man, and the first step, usually mockery and ridicule, this kind of steps it up a notch, because now the work is more pronounced. It is showing fruit, they are getting things done. And here comes the enemy again, but this time the angry feelings and the cutting remarks, which had not been able to stop the work, were being replaced with threats and intimidation of violence. And now it was, the old conspiratorial kind of terrorists. We'll just come in when you're not looking, take one of you off a wall and two of you out over there in the street, and you're in trouble now, man. Now you've gotten us worked up. And the enemy, in gathering their next move, escalates the opposition from simple talk to serious threat. Now, notice in verse 7 that the opposition was growing. They've got a bandwagon now, right? In fact, if this continues, they will soon outnumber the laborers. There is much benefit in any ministry to staying small and obscure, I think, out of the limelight, People get mad, okay, great. But once you begin to be seen, and unfortunately not all ministries can be in the out of the limelight. Sometimes God puts you out there where people know you that you don't know, or the wall goes up and everyone gets upset. And now verse 7's got people from all over the countryside going, oh, we can't have this wall, But it was because they became prominent in their work. And so now it is no longer an attitude of, we don't agree with you and we think you're doing a lousy job. Now it becomes more personal. Now the threat is, if you go to work on the wall, you may lose your life in the process. And the threat is convincing, and it's dangerous. And it should convince you that Satan's not in for a fair fight. He doesn't want to fight fairly. He just wants to win. So, I guess it's good if you can stay out of the limelight, but what if you can't? I suspect that not many of us will ever be asked by the Lord to risk our necks for the cause of Christ. Could be wrong. But I think all the years I've been a Christian, at least in the United States, the greatest threats have always been words, people's attitudes and their dislikes or something. And it can bother you, but it shouldn't bother you for long. I mean, you have your opinion. I just know the Lord. I want you to know him. And so it usually doesn't put you off. But we have friends in Kabul today, Afghanistan, as missionaries. We have 3 families that we know very well in China, working in the underground church. We have, 2 fellows that just left to go to Iran. And they're going as missionaries. And they're being smart about it, but they know what they're getting into. And if they get caught, I suspect that they'll go to jail. It may be worse. I don't know. I hope they don't get caught. God knows. But there are much more difficult places to serve the Lord than here, certainly. We get a free pass almost. We're skating by comparison. And if you've ever wondered to yourself, I wonder how I would handle the pressure, maybe just look at how you handle some old-fashioned criticism or cynicism, because I know you can find that. All you have to do is speak up for the Lord, or some low-level intimidation, On the other hand, if you're going to walk with Jesus in this life, it may be the death of your career, because there may just be certain things you will not do to get ahead. It could be the death to your next sales. It could be the death to a friendship because of your commitment to the Lord. It can kill a romance and take away an advancement and pretty much put your promotion out of reach. The enemy will do all he can to keep you from building the wall. And the wall building for you is reaching out to the lost. He'll do whatever he can to halt the progress, to turn you around. He'll go after your health, your family, your reputation, your commitment. He'll rattle nerves along the ways. He knows which button to push. I remember when I first got saved, I'd gotten a lot of fights in high school. I just fought a lot, just the way we grew up. So when I got saved, the one thing the Lord wanted to take out of my life was that natural response to go, hey, buddy, come here, just for a minute, And we would get like the weirdest stuff that happened to us, just like the enemy would go out of his way to make that harder. We were on Alondra Boulevard going to church one night in the slow lane and had a guy pass me between the curb and the lane. Barely fit his car, and he stuck a knife out the window and did like this to me. Hurry up, he yells at me. And I said to my wife, I'm going to kill this guy. And she said, that's the enemy. I go, I know, and he's driving. We got to pull him over. But I mean, who has that kind of stuff happen to him? But the enemy will, if you're impatient, man, then he'll work on that. If you're caught up in lust, he'll go after that. If things is your deal, man, he'll whatever it takes, he's going to try to stop you. And if I, got to the point finally where I just realized this is the enemy. These weird things do not come normally. He's going out of his way. Then he loses, because I'm going to let the Lord fight the battles. And he's a good God. So now the threats came to the people, and these poor folks just trying to build a wall to protect their kids, their family. They're doing a good work. God is in it. Halfway finished. And we'll talk about that when we get to chapter 4. Halfway finished, there's a tremendous difficulty in halfway finished, isn't there? Because you got just as much work to do as you've done, and yet you've only got a quarter of your energy left, it seems, Finally, verse 10, and then we'll go back and look at the solution. But verse 10, Judah says, and Judah are the people that are building, the strength of the laborers is failing. There's so much rubbish, we're not able to build the wall. And then our adversaries have said that they will neither know nor see anything till we come into their midst and kill them, and, here's the reason, cause the work to cease. And so it was when the Jews who dwelt near them, the enemy, came, they told us 10 times, whatever place you turn, they're going to be upon us. So the length of the work, the relentless onslaught of the opposition, it became a tool into the enemy's hands, and from threat and intimidation came discouragement and fear. Something certainly the enemy wants to use a lot. Now, notice some of the comments from the workers, verse 10. We don't have enough strength. There's so much still to do. There's still so much garbage. And then from our adversaries, they were told, we're going to come and get you. You're not going to see it coming. You're risking your neck. You'd be better off if you stayed home. And if that wasn't enough, then we got guys who lived on the same block as them in verse 12 passing along that information to us. Oh yeah, I was talking to the guys who want to kill us last night. They're over the fence and they're coming. 10 different times they come to the meetings for the wall builders and they're going, yeah, we shouldn't do this. They're going to kill us. Now, first of all, don't ever have friends who hang around with the enemy. That would be your first bet right there. If they got to be mouthpieces for the enemy, you don't need them as friends or as co-laborers. Let them just move along. But notice the discouragement and the fear that this brought. And I must tell you, whenever you want to do something that the Lord has called you to do, there will always be far more people to say that why you can't do it as to encourage you to do it. I remember when we started the church here, we had 3 couples in a house, 2 of which thought it was a horrible idea. And so we had a meeting. Well, why would that be horrible? Oh, it's too hard, it's too ambitious, it's too unrealistic. We don't have the time, we have neither the energy, we don't have the know-how. Okay, I quit. Just disparaging, never visionary, And the last excuse is usually always the one that says, oh, we've tried that before. We've done that, we've tried that, it didn't work. And one theme that you find throughout this book is that, the work of God gets done under pressure. You serve while the enemy lurks about. You stick with God, but you expect opposition, and you learn to handle it. So by nature, through mockery, maybe even ratcheting up to threat and intimidation with the intention of discouraging you, bringing you to fear, getting you to quit serving the Lord. Well, then what do we do? Well, go back to chapter 2, verse 10, and we'll just quickly, as we finish here this morning, look at some of the responses that we find with Nehemiah. The first one, there's no response, verse 10 of chapter 2. And the reason is Nehemiah didn't even know these guys existed. Nor did he know the types of problems these guys were going to cause for him down the road. This verse is purely informational in the sense that God just wants us to know that there is a nature of man that before he sees anything done, he's already against the work of God. We have an unseen enemy. He has a wicked will. He's going to try to oppose you. You may not be aware of him. Trust me, he's there. And before you start freaking out and going, gosh, I always don't get a break. Everything's always against me. Well, wait a minute. Look at what you're doing and who you're serving. And maybe you'll have a bit of rest in the thing because, the enemy by nature is going to seek to oppose the people of God. In verse 19, when the work just began and the three begin to despise and all, the answer of Nehemiah in verse 20 is to say that God will prosper us. We serve the Lord, in other words. His response to the opposition was, look, we serve God. And then he said, you have no past, present, or future, with us in this thing. You have no heritage, no right, no memorial, but we're going to rise up and build. Accuse us of having false motives. Tell the king we're seditionists. We're going to build our own castle. I think he'll know better, but if not, I know that the Lord can take care of us. God's work, God's way, rest in him. So he left it be, and that was it. In chapter 4, verses 1, 2, and 3, when the critics come with all of their, you can knock down the wall with a fox. Nehemiah in verse 4 of chapter 4 prays, and here's his prayer. Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn their reproach on their own heads and give them a plunder to a land of captivity. Do not cover their iniquity. Do not let their sin be blotted out from before you. They have provoked you to anger before the builders. I like this prayer. I know it's a harsh one, but it is a get even prayer, isn't it? Lord, don't let them off the hook. I remember when my sister and I were growing up, we would argue constantly, and it eventually got down to this. I'm going to tell Dad, or I'm going to tell Mom. Oh, don't tell. And I see this prayer of Nehemiah as the same. They start mocking him. Oh, that stupid looking fence is going to fall down. I'm going to tell Dad. I'm going to go rat you out to God. I'll get even with you, buddy. I'll start praying. And he did. Now, he prays that the Lord would just lay into him. He confesses that the person who's no doubt the most angry in all this and provoked is the Lord, because those are his people and this is his work. Nehemiah does not take it upon himself to get even. Nehemiah does not see that vengeance is his, but he is perfectly willing to ask God to take care of it and to deal with it. And what about turning the other cheek or praying like Jesus, Father, forgive them? Well, Jesus also got a whip out twice and went to the temple and cleared the house. I think Jesus was a real man. I think he had a good right cross. The folks left. One guy cleaned out a whole farmer's market in the temple, But he didn't take it upon himself. Look at Jesus' words to the Pharisees there in Matthew 23. The woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. He didn't mince many words, Nehemiah just prayed and he left it with the Lord. In verse 7 and 8 of chapter 4, when mockery becomes threat, we read in verse 9, nevertheless, we made our prayer to God, and then because of them, we set a watch against them day and night. Now again, what was the response to threats? Prayer, God's work. Nevertheless, we have to continue, so we prayed and asked the Lord to help us. And then we did something very practical. We set a watch. Now, prayer is certainly never designed to take the place of practical measures that can be taken responsibly. And unfortunately, I see people do that all the time. They think that's spiritual. Hi, you're out of work? Yeah, how's that going? Oh, I've been praying. Have you been knocking on any doors? Oh, no. I've just been home praying. Well, knucklehead, get the want ads, go knock on doors. God may very well give you a job, but probably you're going to have to be out there looking. It's not too spiritual to just be foolish. So turning to God in prayer, amen, God take care of us. But then, if there's some prudent steps that you can take, do so. We have our friends in Afghanistan, but we never get emails directly from them. Somehow they're washed through 3 or 4 places, and they come with a lot of stuff like, redacted, and then it gets sent back kind of the same way. It sometimes takes 6 weeks to get to them. I'm not sure what they do, but they got to figure it out. They're being wise. I would say if you're worried about being home alone, pray, but then lock the doors. It just makes sense, Don't go wandering around in neighborhoods you don't belong in. Well, I just trust the Lord. Well, you're a knucklehead. Be smart. Trust the Lord. Stay home. Don't be foolish. On the other hand, the word nevertheless is very important, because all of these threats and conspiracies and all, they're trying to create confusion. And Nehemiah said, look, we can't stop. And I think that's important. We should never leave the building for the battle. We should never give up on the work of God, because life has now gotten tough for us. So prayer is vital. Responsible behavior is as well. And if you'll do both, then you can say, look, I'll count the cost and I'm willing to pay the cost. If this costs my life, great. But we've done our best to avoid it. We've done the best that we can. And like I said, there are folks in the mission field tonight that are in far more dangerous places than you and I are. The times that I've been in places that were very dangerous, I've always felt good about it, because I don't go unless I believe the Lord's called me to go. So then you don't sweat it too much. We had to hire in the Philippines right after Marcos fell a guy to sleep outside our room with an AK-47 because they were killing pastors. And so I said, dude, stay awake. I think those were my exact words. Dude, stay awake. But it was all right, because I think we needed to be there. That's what the Lord wanted. Now, had I been there on my own, I don't think I'd have liked it very much. So they set a watch, they prayed, but they kept working. And finally, notice in verse 10, 11, and 12, when the news filters in, and the negative press, and the church or the people of God are now carrying the advice and the words of the enemy. Nehemiah, after hearing all this, verse 13, he said, I positioned men behind the lower parts of the wall at the openings, and I set people according to their families with swords and spears and bows. And I looked and arose and said to the nobles and leaders and the rest of the people, look, don't be afraid of them. You remember the Lord. He's great and awesome. And then you fight for your brethren and sons, daughters, and wives and houses. And it happened when our enemies heard that it was known to us that God had brought their plot to nothing. All of us returned to the wall, everyone to his work. And so it was from that time on. Half of my servants would work at construction. The other half would hold a spear or a shield, a bow, wearing armor, the leaders behind the house of Judah. And those who built on the wall or carried burdens, they loaded themselves so that with one hand they could work and with the other hold a weapon. And every one of the builders had his sword girded at his side, and the one who sounded the trumpet was beside me. And so he said, the work is great and extensive. We're separated on the wall. Whenever you hear the sound of the trumpet, you rally to us. Our God will fight for us, but you come and bring your sword. So in response to the discouragement and fear, here's what Nehemiah did. He rearranged the workload so everyone worked closer to their homes. He set them in families. Work by your house. You have to worry about your family. You don't have to work across town. So he put them closer to their concern. He put them on a work that would be the most beneficial to them. It would protect their neighborhoods. And then he chastised them. He said, look, don't forget God. I know you're all overwhelmed and upset with these guys and their threats, but look, God is great and awesome. He's gotten us this far. Don't forget him. And that's unfortunately what happens when you get discouraged or fearful. You usually have gotten your eyes off the Lord, and yet greater is he that's in us than he that's in the world. So even when the crisis in verse 15 was averted, the work returned in full force, but Nehemiah took security steps that would slow down the work but would protect the people. Work with one hand, carry your weapon in the other. These weren't funny days, or these weren't easy times, but they were going to do the work of God. So good practical measures of faith. But notice again, they weren't stopping the work. One thing that didn't happen, the work didn't stop, which is the enemy's will. So, we have this wonderful commission as the church, as the body, to go out to the world and tell them about Christ. But you're going to run into trouble, and it's going to bring trouble to your life. You can be as kind as you want, have as good intentions as you like, share as meekly as possible. It's a spiritual battle, and mockery and discouragement and all those things come your way. Hopefully you'll never see threat and intimidation. I pray you never do. It's not worth it. So often to be upset by that. But it may. What can't happen is that we can't stop moving forward. You know, the work is eternal. It's too important. And I think God would have us be aware that the battle is going to take place. But there's work to do, isn't there? The nevertheless has to be our statement. We're going to keep at it, right? I think Paul wrote to the Romans, we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. John writes at 90 years old, 1 John 5:14. No, it's not 5:14, it's 5:4. This is the victory that we have in the world, our faith. This is the victory that overcomes the world, our faith. And Paul wrote to the Corinthians, thanks be to God who always gives us victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Big world out there. Lots of people are lost. That's why you're here. So you might tell them how they can know the God that loves you. Don't let the difficulty put you off. And don't leave the building for the battle. Battle's going to be there anyway. Aren't you glad we win? We win.